live from Sister Basebone Studio. Urban Teachers Lounge is a platform for bridging the gap between educational scholarship and classroom teachers. Voices will include teachers, administrators, educational scholars, community members, and activists.
Hey everybody, welcome to Urban Teachers Lounge. I'm your host, G. Funmilayo DeVoe. This podcast is unapologetically for Black teachers, unapologetically by Black teachers. The purpose of the program is to bridge the gap between educational scholarship and classroom teachers. This week, I'm talking about teacher evaluation systems. This is going to be a good one, y'all. Go get your coffee. Make sure it's extra hot because we got some stuff to talk about. All right. I trust that you have your coffee. So I will say this. Hi. I will say this. This has been an interesting prep for this particular podcast because I have so many directions in which to go. Of course, you Google or go into any academic library and look up teacher evaluation systems. You know, a plethora of research is out there. And I'm trying to narrow it down. So even in initially, the reason why I chose this topic was because about, let's see when it's dated, the end of last year, there was an article that came out. It's called Interrogating Teacher Evaluation, Unveiling Whiteness as the Normative Center and Moving the Margins by Dr. Maria del Carmen Salazar. So when I saw this, I was like, oh, yes, I'm definitely going to do a podcast on teacher evaluation. And then, you know, this was back in November, I believe, when this came out. And because this is fresh off the press, like this is just this past November that it was published. And so right away, I was like, yeah, I'm going to talk about this. And then, you know, time went on. I got an evaluation or so since this point. So then I'm like, oh, it's going to be some biases of my own coming through. But I also, you know, I not only do I want to share my own story about my experience with evaluations in the 17 years that I've been teaching, I also wanted to make sure that I had you know, some research. So I'm going to only stick to, it's very difficult to do, I'm only going to stick with 2 articles. So the first article, I just told you, it's called Interrogating Teacher Evaluation. And then the other article, the title of that one is Administrators' Uses of Teacher Observation Protocol in Different Rating Contexts. So let's start with, I want to give you some vocabulary words because I think it is very important to understand not only the words, but to understand how they're being used. And I think it was last week I mentioned about how wordplay is really big, you know, and we really have to understand that the wordplays, things that sound good, you know, they're not always good. So I'm going to give you a couple of words right off. And then when I go through the explaining the 2 articles, the high points that I definitely want you to read and I definitely want you to respond about, because the 25 minutes that I'm going to try to squeeze all of this in is not enough time at all. So my vocabulary words, 1, critical race theory. You hear me talk about that a lot. That is my main framework when I do research. So I'm going to quote the critical race theory that is actually in the article. And so that'll just help us to, you know, get some understanding on that. So CRT, critical race theory, is a body of scholarship that challenges discourses, ideologies, and structures that reproduce racism and inequality or inequity, right? And then you have critical race theory in education. So that's taking it another step forward, and it also shows how we need to look at how race is handled in education. So the definition for that is CRT in education is defined as a framework or set of basic perspectives, methods, and and pedagogy that seeks to identify, analyze, and transform those structural, cultural, and interpersonal aspects of education that maintain the marginal position and subordination of students of color. Translation: what are the things that are in education that are stemmed in white supremacy and racism? Right? So what are those things that we continue to use as status quo? We continue to justify whiteness as property. That's a whole other thing. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even say that to you because that's not a word I'm going to give you right now. And then the 5 tenets that go into CRT. When you're really looking at it, these are the things that you're looking for in critical race theory. Number 1, the centrality of race and racism. So you want to center race around this in this conversation. Number 2, challenge the dominant ideology. So the one that says Black people are not intellectuals. We don't have intellectual capital, right? That's a challenge. We're challenging that. Number 3, the importance of experiential knowledge of communities of color. So, a lot of people love Black people, but you don't understand the cultural aspects and have true knowledge of, and not from a sympathetic perspective, but from a understanding, understanding position, understanding race, gender, and class, and how that works. The next one, number 4, is a commitment to social justice, which is definitely my big piece, being committed to social justice. And the last one, number 5, the use of interdisciplinary perspectives. So I wanted to give that. So you have critical race theory is a theory or a framework that centers race, and it challenges any white supremacist, any thing that marginalizes people of color specifically, right? Now, I will say there are different levels of or different aspects of critical race theory. You have critical race theory in education. You have what they call lit crit, which looks at immigration and language, right? That is predominantly dealt with from this perspective of our Latino brothers and sisters, right? So they've looked at how critical race theory could expand to add language, right? And how we use English as a dominant language. Okay, I'm not going to go off on that tangent. And then there's some other things that I want to, other words that we are very much familiar with, but I want to put them out here. Subjective. So subjective means personal, excessive emphasis on one's own moods, attitudes, etc. And then objective, right? Not influenced by your personal feelings. That's important, and we'll come back to that. The last phrase or vocabulary for this moment is value added. So value added, we started seeing this after the testing and high stakes testing had taken over education. And value added basically means it's a method of teacher evaluation that measures the teacher's contribution in a given year by comparing the current test scores of their students to the previous one. So basically, you want to see if the students are growing, right? That sounds good because I want to see if you're growing, right? But there's a difference between growth and proficiency. I'm not going to talk about that yet either. So those are the basic words that I want to look at. And then I'm going to jump right into these 2 articles. So the first article that I talked about was by Salazar. So she talks, what I appreciate about this is the entire article is written through the lens of critical race theory. So she's looking at teacher evaluations and she's analyzing teacher evaluations with the lens of race, with the lens of how are we maintaining whiteness or white ways of knowing, white supremacist ways of being, even in our evaluation. So what I loved about this article, I think is fabulous. She actually created a culturally relevant teacher evaluation system, and it's called FEET, F-E-E-T, Framework for Equitable and Excellent Teaching. So one of the key things that she writes in this one is she's talking about white streaming. And how, what is white streaming? So I'm going to give, I wanted to give you that definition while I'm talking about her article. She says white streaming is a coercive force that imposes white history, morals, language, customs, individualism, cultural capital, and other forces as the norm or standard in U.S. society. Thus, the master narrative of objectivity and neutrality universalizes the dominant group's interests, namely maintaining white supremacy and systematically excluding historically marginalized populations. So all of that, let's break this down. The bottom line is the way things have been set up, it's set up from a position, a dominant position of knowing, right? And that position excludes anything that is not of the dominant culture, i.e. whiteness, white supremacy. And in its exclusion, it also devalues, right? So she created this this framework, this evaluation system to now look at how are teachers teaching. So if you're going to evaluate teachers that are teaching marginalized children, how are you measuring them? Are you measuring them from the position of equity, of social justice? Are you measuring them from cultural relevance? Or are you measuring them on a standard that is not, it's not inclusive, right? And so I thought that was a very important, I think this is a very good idea. I would love to see something like this. She has a lot of indicators and competencies. I just want to read a couple of them. One was engage students in an inclusive and supportive learning community. What that includes: establish affirming relationships with the students and their families, use equitable classroom management strategies, right? Actively engage students in learning. Like, these are things that we hear, but then she goes into detail on what that really looks like. Plan rigorous and relevant standards and outcome-based lessons and unit plans. So again, using it, more specifically, she talks about using culturally relevant, backward design curriculum planning to develop units. So what is the end? What is the end game? What do you want the kids to learn? So in my class, we've been working on The Great Gatsby. I love that book. I love the movie as well, right? So when you look at The Great Gatsby, we need to be, the students really need to understand the American dream. Who's marginalized from that American dream? Who actually gets to live the American dream, right? And what are the factors that play in there? Race, gender, and class. And depending on how you teach that, is it culturally relevant for the students that you are teaching? And in my case, I teach Black children. I'm a Black teacher. I teach Black kids and brown students as well. So I teach predominantly marginalized, traditionally marginalized kids. So the one thing that I wanted to say about this, I would love to see this go further, meaning, she works out the limitations that she mentions. I think one big limitation that I'm going to be very frank about is Black and brown scholars, their research is also marginalized, right? And so when I think of teacher evaluations, I'm thinking about, let's think about this. State Board of Education's control teacher evaluation system, because of course you're trying to make a standardized something, but you can't. There are limits and there are limitations to standardized evaluation systems, particularly when they are not socially just and they are not inclusive of all the students that we are teaching. So that was my one concern about how can we get this type of evaluation on a large scale and even have other people try it out, other school districts to try it out, to get it. At least she started the conversation and she says we need to make sure that we are culturally relevant even in our evaluation system. So that's that one. And then the other article. So when I pulled this article up, I was like, oh, you know what? This is going to be a great article. I looked at the title. And again, I'll give you my backdrop on the title, right? So I looked at the title and it talks about administrators' uses of teacher observation protocol in different rating contexts. So I said, bet, I'm looking at it. And then, like the scholar and student that I am, I looked at who wrote it, ETS. Oh, this is the Educational Testing Service. Oh, these are the people that create standardized tests, naming GRE, which is the graduate admission test, HiSET, which is a high school test that they have, Praxis, which is the teacher standardized test that most teachers have to take in U.S., right? They do the International English TOEFL. I always say it right or wrong. TOEFL, right? So this is this is an organization that creates standardized tests. So my first problem with this was, hold up. So you created a test and you created the evaluation system, and now you're saying, we need to examine it. So that put a like, what you gonna tell me type thought in my head. So the two things that set out for me in this particular article was the setting of the research. And that was very key, because even in this article, which I would tell you all to read, and let's talk about it, send me some quotes or questions, or you can come on and have your take on this article. But in a research setting, if you're doing research, the raters don't know the teachers that they're observing. So this article talked about observations specifically. So it talked about it talked about administrators observing. So the two things, of course, they do observation, and then they also do this value added, right? So within the value added, of course, if your kids pass the test, if they don't pass the test, did you grow them at all? And that bottom line is your money. Either you move the kids and you show growth because they moved, or however this is going, which typically, is questionable, whether you encourage this growth or not, or we're not looking at any other external factors, right? And we're looking at their test scores, and we're also looking at observations. So what this article brings out is, in a research, when the researchers are doing this, the raters come in and they don't know the teachers that they're observing. So they may have a non-bias. I mean, I would venture to say, I don't know you, so I'm just going to rate you according to here's the standards. Whereas in real life, the administrator who knows you, depending on what kind of relationship that there is, if you have a positive relationship with your administrator or a negative relationship with your administrator, that might make your evaluation subjective or objective, right? And so that is a major limitation, because at that moment, you now know this could be accurate and it could not be. But let's go back to the reality of, because this goes along with the high stakes testing, teachers' jobs, livelihood is at stake. So somebody can come in and they can evaluate you, and were they culturally relevant when they evaluated you? Were they considering where your kids started when they got with you and where they ended? Because what ends up happening is, and that goes back to that growth and to proficiency. So if I teach a kid that comes to me on a 5th grade level, and you should be on a high school reading level, if I got you to a 6th grade level, you moved, you grew. But if you didn't pass the test, the standardized test again, then guess what? If you're judging me on the standardized test scores, that's really not accurate, because you have not acknowledged the fact that I did move the child. I just didn't necessarily get them to pass an 11th grade test. Okay. Number 2, this article mentioned something that was very interesting. It said, normally when school districts adopt new evaluation systems, the raters, the administrators, they take the massive training classes. But then what happens between the time that they take the training and they go into classrooms and they start doing observations and they start rating? Questions come into play, right? So now does the trainer need a refresher course? Did you forget some of the things? Like, how often do you go back? And this leads to something that I thought was very, very, very important. What do I do with my paper now? It's called risk and distortion, right? And so they give as an example, I'm pulling it up on my computer. I had it here a second ago. What are the risks and what is the distortions? Mainly because, again, if this is not culturally relevant, then you're risking rating somebody probably inaccurately, right? So, and because I had it here and now I'm looking for it, right? Oh, my. Wait, I think I wrote it somewhere else. This is why I have so many papers where I write stuff down. So when it talks about risk concerns the extent to which variations in measures reflect biased or chance variations rather than the actual efforts of the employee. So if you're judging this, and let's maintain the thought of a culturally relevant evaluation. If you're judging a teacher on specifically on this is what the standard said, you should have given this, you should have this on the wall, you should be moving the kids should be doing heavy lifting, that sounds great. But if you're not looking at what's really going on and how the teacher is really moving them, you're risking to have a bad evaluation or a bad rating that might not be valid. Then they give the other word, distortion. So the distortion concerns the degree to which the measures fail to adequately measure the true value of an employee's performance. So even though you say these are the standards, right? And you're suggesting that these are the standards. If you meet these marks, if you check these boxes, guess what? This is what makes you a great teacher. Well, if you're not considering everything that's going on in the classroom, including the cultural relevance in the classroom, right? If you're not considering where the student was when they got here, where they are now, there are several things that can skew your rating. So, this was a very difficult, for whatever, this was a difficult podcast. I think because I had so much that I wanted to share and I was looking up so much and I'm trying to narrow it down. And just like anything else, I have a million things that I could really bring out in this particular paper. But when I think about evaluations, the bottom line is teachers' livelihood is often at stake according to a student's ability to do something. Again, that sounds very good. You should expect a teacher to move a child from one level, from point A to point B, if you've been with them for an entire school year. That is reasonable. My question is, what does that growth look like? So I was challenged not too long ago about my students, me not using data to drive my instruction. Well, I was beyond offended by that statement because I have data that showed where my students' reading level was. And I said, because their reading level is here, I'm going to put this in place. I'm going to require this. I'm going to drive them in this, and this. And I'm going to force them to do, we have one reading program that will put the kids exactly on their reading level, and it will push them up. It's individualized. I love the program. And then we have another online tool that I use that I can give them on-level reading material, right? Because I need you to still be exposed to online reading material. And so it will counter out. But if you tell me you're not because of your grades, your data doesn't show that the kids are moving. It's like, no, I'm using data. One, I'm using data to drive the instruction. Two, but you're overlooking the reality of when they came to me, according to my benchmark data, when I got them first day, this is the level that they were on. Today, to date, they've moved. Those who have done what I told them to do, who I've encouraged, they've moved. But you're not judging me on that. And so this is the reason why I've had such a, this particular topic has been hot for me. Like I've actually lost sleep for the last couple of days, just trying to be politically correct, but also be very blunt and very true to, you cannot expect, when our children sometimes come in so far below level. If I'm teaching high school and you're on an elementary school reading level, tell me why exactly you think you're going to pass a high school test without me doing a whole lot of work. And even if you do it, you still might squeak by. But then you judge me as I'm not giving enough. I'm not doing enough. And that goes back to what ETS actually said, the risk and the distortion, because you're presenting because of data. You can use data to say what you want it to say, good, bad, or indifferent, right? But if you're skewing the data and you're looking at the data that says all your kids are on, they failed this test, so you must not be teaching. I'm sorry, what? So I'm not teaching because so many of them failed the test, but I gave you the base data and I told you I'm building them up to be able to do this. But I have to give the test because you insist that every other week I give another test, right? I'm trying not to go off on this tangent about this because, again, when you're talking about high stakes, there was a quote here that, let me see if I can find this quote, which actually started with this ETS article that I'm presenting to you. It was on the very first page, and it talked about high stakes, right? So here's I think this is it right here. It says, although the consequences associated with using observations to evaluate teachers vary, observation ratings are included in high-stakes evaluation systems in many states. So number one, you already know there's an issue. There's a contradiction in having high stakes testing and then you have high stakes evaluation, because you're constantly proving the fake ideology, which we learned this with critical race theory. You want to continue the ideology that black children can't learn. And guess what? They can't learn because you keep giving them a test and they can't pass the test. Even though you didn't allow me to really teach them and grow them where I need to. You just kept telling them, you're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. Okay. So the rest of this quote says, for high stakes systems to support the improvement of teaching to be seen by stakeholders as legitimate for sorting and rewarding teachers, accurate observation ratings are necessary. Let me read that again, because, I had to stop. For high-stakes systems to support the improvement of teaching to be seen by stakeholders as legitimate. For what? Sorting and rewarding teachers, accurate observation ratings are necessary. This is a problem. This was in the first page, right? So that, I told you, I started out, I said, ETS wrote this. Okay, let me breathe. Inhale, exhale, right? So you're saying in order for high stakes testing high stakes systems to support teacher improvement, how are you supporting teacher improvement if your goal for this test is to sort and reward? Sorting and rewarding is not improving and making better. And guess what? The same way we sort and reward our students is the same way that teachers are being sorted and rewarded. So at the end of the day, if the evaluation says one thing and the evaluation was not culturally competent, right? And you're looking through the lens of, if you didn't check this box and you didn't check this box, then you're not a good teacher. You already know the risk and the distortion of that. However, you still use this for the process of sorting and rewarding. But let me add that next sentence that went with that. Therefore, various factors associated with the processes through which observation ratings are created, including those related to both raters and rating contexts, require policymakers' attention. So this is talking about ETS, who is, a large testing organization that makes much money for giving people tests, right? And then you tell that's a business, right? That's a mega business. And then you say it requires policymakers' attention. And I keep asking the same questions over and over again. What happened to the researchers? Researchers keep putting this information out, and the research is being marginalized. So I'm going to stop right here because I'm pretty sure I'm over my time. I'm so glad that you were here today. I hope that we can continue this conversation on teacher evaluation systems and how we can make them work. I hope you share this podcast with your community of teachers, scholars, and activists. Love to hear from you. Please follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Podomatic, YouTube, Twitter. Leave your comments, leave your suggestions. I will leave the name of the 2 articles at the end of the podcast. Until we meet again, peace, power, and progress.